From KPRC2, this is Houston Newsmakers with Cambrell Marshall.
The images coming from Israel and Gaza have been horrific after the attack by Hamas that killed more than 1,000 Israelis, with many more injured. A surprise attack that provoked an Israeli response that also has killed more than 1,000, with many more injured. So how do we get to this point? Clearly, it is a result of many years of unrest and discord between Israel and the Palestinians, a long and complicated process which began with the British mandate in 1920 to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. It's a move that has been resisted by many Palestinians since then, and leading to Hamas, one of the groups that does not recognize such a right for Jews. It was in July when I had Ambassador David Satterfield on Houston Newsmakers to talk about the unrest in Israel amid the challenges faced by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as he was and is still facing charges of fraud. Satterfield is also the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy and has negotiated with both sides in the Middle East. Well, he was here at the station earlier this week and talked with anchor Keith Garvin about the uneasy tension in the region between Israel and Hamas and the options going forward.
But the general concept was Hamas would recognize, Israel believed, that its interests were served not by attacking outside the Strip, but by allowing the peaceful movement of workers from the Gaza Strip into Israel and accepting financing primarily from Qatar, the state of Qatar, which would allow Hamas to be able to provide for the needs of its people. And this arrangement, this concept of operations, was what governed most of that period between 2014 and today. But then came the events of Saturday. The scope of this horrific violence against Israeli civilians is unprecedented. And just for a moment, more Jews killed, murdered in a single day since the end of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. More Israeli civilian dead in a single event since the founding of the state. Over 100 hostages taken, children, elderly, and brought back into Gaza. There is no parallel or precedent to this. Now, traditionally, the focal point of the Israeli people, of their governments, has been the return of hostages, living or dead. But with these numbers and with the death count as it is and rising with every hour that passes, the dilemma facing the Israeli government is going to be, do you negotiate for the hostages, which typically means release of Palestinian prisoners or other concessions, or do you simply demand their release unharmed?
So now it is Hamas capturing the headlines as the organization responsible for the indiscriminate killing of more than 1,000 Jews. What should we know about Hamas and its history? For that, we go to Dr. Imran El-Badawi, chair of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and associate professor and director of Middle East Studies at the University of Houston.
Hamas as an organization is identified by numerous Western countries, including the United States and the European Union, and of course Israel, as a terrorist organization. It calls itself, of course, the Islamic Resistance Movement in Palestine. So as an organization, its goal is to, its stated goal, of course, is to defeat the Israeli state. It does not recognize its legitimacy. And of course, it fights to liberate the Palestinian people, again, through the doctrine of jihad and through the different, through Islamic, through their worldview of Islam. They are, in essence, a distant offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is a group that was formed after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and the collapse of what we call the Islamic Caliphate. That's like, you could think about, your viewers may think about it as an Islamic pope. And in its place, in that power vacuum, the Muslim Brotherhood was formed in 1928. By 1988, the group that we know as Hamas was formed, partly out of an offshoot of the Muslim Brothers in Jordan. And they reside and they operate out of the place that we call today the Gaza Strip. Of course, in 1988, there was the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, against the Israeli occupation. And Hamas played no small role in, riling up the masses and, of course, fighting against what they saw as an illegal occupation and various violations of international law. But seriously, in the 1990s until about 94, the Oslo Accords, most of Hamas's activity was limited to assassinations of other Palestinians, typically those that were cooperating with the State of Israel and things of that nature. Their activity expanded, I would say, in the early 2000s, especially after the year 2000, which is the second Intifada, or the second uprising of the Palestinian people, to include more targeted assassinations of Israeli entities and Israeli assets. In 2006, it's a watershed year. Israel evacuates Gaza because there's just too much conflict overall. And there are elections held that put Hamas in competition with the PLO. Now they're called Fatah. So you have the Islamic and the secular governance of Palestine in conflict in 2006. And the democratic elections favor Hamas. And of course, this gets totally rejected by the international community. And the PLO, of course, is limited then to the West Bank, and Gaza is left for Hamas. And since 2006, the whole Gaza Strip has been in a blockade, has been under blockade or under siege, really, especially today, by Israel. And its activity has really been rocket fire, and as we saw, just a couple of days ago, actual penetration of the State of Israel and conducting all sorts of terrorist activity. I have no qualms about calling them a terrorist group. What they did is quite horrible and barbaric, but it comes after a very long history and an endless cycle of violence, of which the latest episode is what we saw the other day.
So it is clear this current conflict is far from over, with Israel declaring war and heading into Gaza with the stated goal of destroying Hamas. But what are the hopes for any kind of future peace?
I have hope in young people. We say a lot of, we say a lot about Gen Z and millennials and so on and so forth. One thing that I teach in all my courses is critical thinking. If we are going to merely copy the older generations of Jews and Arabs and Muslims and Christians, if we're going to do that, we're going to be in conflict forever. This is why we're here. It's 2023, and it is embarrassing that the longest running conflict and occupation in modern history is still here. I'm really, appealing, and I'm talking to the younger generations. The older generations, I don't have much hope for, honestly. And I'm hoping that the younger generation can think critically, can, reach into their soul where, they know that they can share relationships and roommates and educate themselves with people who are not of their ethnic and religious and cultural and racial background. Those people should see that there is another way forward. We don't have to live in this this barbaric reality of tit-for-tat violence, this cycle of violence which started in 1948. We need to liberate ourselves from the older generations and the warmongers and the deep pockets who are keeping this conflict going.